You were a mistake. Go." The Duke of Ravenscar said the 3 words into the gray dawn the way a man closes a ledger, and across the cold marble of his own great hall, his wife of 11 days did not flinch. Marigold Vane stood at the foot of his staircase with her traveling cloak already on her shoulders, her chin level, her hands quiet at her sides. She had been awake since 4. She had heard the servants whispering through the wall, heard the wheels of the carriage being brought round before she was even told, and she had understood with the plain certainty she read weather by, that the man at the top of the stairs had decided something in the night that he believed was wisdom. She had married into a house where decisions came down like frost. She did not argue with frost. Behind her, through the open doors, the black carriage waited in the courtyard, and the 2 gray horses breathed steam into the cold. If she broke now in this hall, every servant in Ravenscar would carry the story for 40 years. How the bought duchess wept on the stairs, she would not give them the story. She drew one slow breath, and she said, "As you wish, your grace." And her voice did not shake. Aldous Sable, the 8th Duke of Ravenscar, watched her from the top step and told himself this was a mercy. He was 34 years old, and he had buried a mother, a father, and a brother, and he had learned the same lesson from each grave, which was that everything a man allowed himself to love became a wound the world could open at will. He had married Marigold Vane because the estate required an heir, and the lawyers required a wife, and he had expected a transaction. He had not expected to lie awake 3 nights running listening for the sound of her turning a page in the next room. He had not expected to find himself, 2 evenings ago, standing outside her door with his hand raised to knock, and no reason in the world to give her for knocking. That was the weakness. That was the thing he had watched destroy his father after his mother died. A strong man hollowed out by needing one person. So he had done what a Sable did with a weakness. He had decided to remove it. Distance, he had reasoned at 3 in the morning, was simply the cure taken early before the disease had time to root. Send her to the dower house at Marsh Halloway, 40 miles east, and let the wanting starve. His valet, a careful old man named Birch, who had dressed 3 dukes and outlived 2, stood in the doorway of the hall with the duke's coffee going cold on a silver tray, and Birch said nothing, because Birch had learned that a Sable in the grip of a decision was a door already shut. But Birch watched the young woman pick up her single small case herself, because no footman had been told to carry it, and Birch's jaw tightened. There was a girl, too, Posy, a kitchen child of 9, who'd attached herself to the new Duchess with a child's whole undefended heart, because Marigold had once knelt on the cold flags and shown her how to fold a napkin into a swan, and Posy stood half hidden behind the long curtains by the window, and the cat that owned the great hall, a vast gray beast named Cromwell who tolerated no one, had come out from the warm hearth and pressed himself against Marigold's ankle, and would not be moved. The Duke noticed none of this. He saw only the woman and the necessity, and the long, cold corridor of the rest of his life, arranged neatly the way he liked his life arranged. What he did not see, because he had never once looked, was the letter. It was a single folded sheet of cream paper, sealed with a thick disk of crimson wax, and it lived against Marigold's heart, tucked into the seam of her glove where the leather met her wrist. Her mother had pressed it into her hand on the worst morning of her life, and told her to open it only when she had nowhere left to go. Marigold had carried it through the auction of her father's debts, through the cold charity of an aunt who counted every potato, through the strange, brisk arrangement of her marriage, and she had never opened it because she had decided, with the stubbornness that was the truest thing in her, that she would never let herself have nowhere left to go. The wax seal bore a crest. It was not the Vane crest. It was older than the Vanes and grander. And if the Duke of Ravenscar had looked at it even once across 11 days of marriage, the whole cold architecture of this dawn would have come down. He did not look. He turned and went into his study and shut the door so that he would not have to watch the carriage leave. Marigold went out into the courtyard. The cold took her breath. She set her case on the carriage floor herself, and she put her gloved hand on the door frame, and she paused. Not to look back, never to look back, but because the kitchen child Posy had run out across the frozen gravel in her thin dress and was clinging to Marigold's cloak and crying in the gulping way of children who have not yet learned to be quiet. Marigold knelt. She was very gentle. She told the girl that ladies who go away always come back when the road's dry, which was a lie she had been told once and had hated, and she gave it now as the only kindness she had to give. She pressed something into Posy's red hand, a swan folded out of her own handkerchief, and she stepped up into the carriage, and she sat very straight, and the door closed, and the wheels began to turn. She did not weep. She watched the courtyard of Ravenscar slide past the window and grow small, and she thought, quite clearly, that she had survived worse mornings than this, and would survive this one too. The question that would haunt the whole long day, the one the Duke had handed himself without knowing it, was simple, and it would not leave him alone. What does a man do with a house he has finally got empty? Aldous found out within the hour. The silence began politely. It was the silence he had wanted, the silence he had told himself was the natural order of a duke's house. No rustle of pages, no quiet question at breakfast, no light step on the upper landing. He sat at his enormous desk, and he addressed his correspondence, and he informed himself, content. Then the long case clock in the corner struck 9, and he became aware that he had read the same line of a tenant's complaint 4 times, and understood none of it, and that he was listening with his whole body for a sound that was no longer in the house. The page turn. He set down his pen. He told himself it was the cold. He went to find warmth and found instead the small things. Her teacup, the one with the chipped gold rim that she had quietly chosen for herself off the housekeeper's shelf rather than take the best, sat washed and upturned on the breakfast sideboard. In the morning room a book lay open and face down where she had left it, and he picked it up before he could stop himself and saw that she had been 3 pages from the end and would now never finish it. And he, the Duke of Ravenscar, who had ordered a war of distance against his own heart at 3 a.m, stood in his own morning room holding a borrowed novel a stranger had nearly finished, and felt the floor of his certainty give very slightly, not a crack you can see, but a sound that travels up through the soles of the feet, the first warning that ice is about to go. He put the book down. He went to the window. The courtyard was empty. The gravel still scuffed where a child had run across it. And here, because this is the part of the story I have been waiting to tell you, I will ask you something. If you have ever watched a proud person send away the one thing they could not afford to lose, and quietly hope to see them learn it before it was too late, then you already belong here. So take a moment to subscribe, because that ache, the moment a cold man discovers his cure was the wound, is the only kind of love story I tell on this channel. Now, back to the Duke at his window and the longest day of his life. He lasted, all told, a little under 4 hours. In those 4 hours, he tried everything a disciplined man tries. He went down to the stables and inspected horses he did not need to inspect. He answered 3 letters and could not have told you their contents under oath. He went up to the long, cold gallery, where the dead sables hung in their gilded frames in 2 unbroken centuries of unsmiling men. And he stood before the portrait of his mother, a dark-eyed woman who had laughed in a house that had not laughed since, and he tried to summon the old lesson, that love is a door the world walks through to gut you. And for the first time in his life, the lesson would not hold its shape. He knew exactly where the lesson had come from, because he had watched it taught. He had been 11 the winter his mother died, old enough to remember the house, before and after. Before there had been music in the evenings and a woman who pulled her son into her lap in front of company and didn't care that a duke's heir was meant to sit apart. After there had been his father, the 7th Duke, a man Aldous had worshipped, reduced to a gray shape that wandered the corridors at night calling a name no one answered. His father had not been killed by a fever. The fever had killed his mother. His father had been killed slowly over 9 years, by having loved her so completely that her absence took the rest of him out the same door. And then his brother, Treat, Edmund, 2 years older, the warm one, the one meant to inherit, had ridden out one bright autumn morning and not come home. And Aldous at 25 had become a duke he had never been raised to be, standing at a 3rd graveside, listening to a reverend say the words a 3rd time, and he had made himself a promise over that grave that he had kept for 9 years, with the discipline of a man holding a wall against the sea. He would never love anything the world could take, because the taking was not the cruelty, the loving was. The loving was what opened the door. So he had built a life with no doors at all, and he had been, by his own cold accounting, safe, right up until a quiet auburn-haired stranger had moved into the next room and begun, without asking his permission, to turn pages, because the woman he had sent away that morning had never once asked him for the door. She had folded swans for kitchen children. She had taken the chipped cup so a servant would not have to apologize for the good one. She had stood in his hall while he called her a mistake, and she had not begged, had not wept, had not used a single one of the soft weapons he had armored himself against. She had simply said, "As you wish," and gone, and her dignity, which he had taken for coldness to match his own, revealed itself now, hours too late, as something else entirely. The bearing of a woman who had decided long ago that she would never let anyone see her bleed. He had married a wall to keep out the weather. He was learning far too slowly that the wall had a garden behind it. If you've made it this far into Marigold's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. It was Birch who broke it open, though Birch was far too old and far too wise to do anything so vulgar as offer an opinion. The valet came to take the cold coffee away, and as he lifted the tray, he said in the flat voice of a man reporting the weather, "Her Grace left her gloves, sir, the gray kid pair. I found them on the hall table." And he set the gloves down beside the Duke's hand and went out. Aldous looked at the gloves. They were small and worn at one fingertip, and they smelled very faintly of the lavender water she used, and tucked into the seam of the right glove, where the leather met the wrist, was the folded corner of a cream letter she had forgotten in the cold and the haste of being thrown out of a house. He should not have opened it. He knew, even as his fingers found the wax, that a gentleman did not read his wife's private letters, and he no longer cared, because somewhere in the last 4 hours, the careful, disciplined Duke of Ravenscar had stopped being able to afford his own manners. He broke the crimson seal. He did not at first read the words at all. He looked at the seal in his palm, the broken disc of wax, at the crest pressed into it, and the blood went out of his face. He knew the crest. Every man of his rank knew the crest. It belonged to the old Duchy of Westford, a line everyone in England believed had died out 20 years ago, when its last duke lost a daughter and a wife to a fever in a single black winter, and let his title go dark rather than remarry. The whole of society had mourned the romance of it, and here it was, this dead and grieving crest, pressed in fresh wax into a letter that had ridden away that morning in the glove of the woman Aldous Sable had called a mistake and sent 40 miles into the cold. He unfolded the page. The hand was a woman's, faded, written by candlelight, by someone who had known she was dying. "My Marigold," it began. "By the time you have nowhere left to go, the men who took everything will be old or dead, and you will be a woman grown, and you may finally claim what your father hid you to keep you safe from. You are not a Vane. The name was your shield. You are the only living heir of Westford, and the crest on this seal is yours, and everything that crest commands is yours. And any man who casts you out as nothing will one day learn he turned away from his own door the one woman in England who outranked him." The letter went on, but the Duke had stopped reading. He was already on his feet. What happened next happened very fast, and it is worth telling slowly. Aldous Sable was a cold man and a proud man, but no one had ever, in 34 years, called him a slow one. He understood 3 things in the space of a single breath. He understood that the woman he had married was not a convenience the lawyers had found him, but the lost heir of a duchy grander than his own. He understood that this changed precisely nothing about why he was now reaching for his riding coat, because if she had been a beggar's daughter, he would have been reaching for it all the same. The letter had not made him want her. It had only stripped away the last lie he had been telling himself, which was that she was beneath the cost of wanting. And he understood, with a cold, clean horror, that he had put her on the east road at dawn, that it was now past noon, that 40 miles of bad winter road lay between Ravenscar and Marsh Halloway, and that somewhere on that road, in a carriage he had ordered, was a woman he had spent 11 days falling in love with and one morning throwing away. He did not ride after her like a lover in a ballad. He was a duke, and he made it a campaign. He called for the steward and the head groom and the 2 fastest riders in the stable, and standing in the courtyard, with the broken seal still in his fist, he gave the orders that by nightfall the whole county would be telling at every inn between Ravenscar and the sea. Every road out of the duchy was to be stopped. Not watched, stopped. Riders to the 3 toll gates and the river bridge and the crossroads at Helmswell, and any carriage moving east toward Marsh Halloway was to be turned, gently and with apology, and a duke's coin for the trouble, and held until he came. He sent his fastest man ahead on his fastest horse, with one instruction: find the Duchess's carriage, and do not, on pain of dismissal, let it reach Marsh Halloway. Birch watching from the steps, allowed himself the smallest movement of his old mouth that on another man might have been called a smile, and went to fetch the Duke's gloves, his own, the riding pair. Without being asked, the orders went out like water down a cracked dam, and the county felt them move. At the south toll, a sleepy keeper named Hartley was woken from his afternoon doze by two riders who told him no eastbound wheel was to pass by order of his grace. And Hartley, who had taken the Duke of Ravenscar's silver for 30 years and never once seen the Duke do anything that was not cold and exact, stood in the road with his hat in his hand and wondered what in the name of heaven had happened up at the great house. At the river bridge the orders crossed paths with the carrier's cart and the parson's gig and a farmer driving pigs, and all of them were turned, courteously, with a coin, and all of them carried the story onward to wherever they were turned back toward, so that by the middle of the afternoon there was no inn between Ravenscar and the marsh that did not have some version of it. The cold Duke had run mad. The cold Duke had locked his own gates. The cold Duke had thrown out his bride at dawn and was tearing the duchy apart by dark to fetch her home. By 2 o'clock, the first carriage had been turned at the Helmswell crossroads, and it was the wrong carriage, a wine merchant bound for the coast, and the merchant grumbled about lordly whims until the Duke's coin changed his mind. By 3 o'clock, a rider came back, lathered to say, the Duchess's carriage had been seen at the Bell at Ostwick at 11, had changed horses, and gone on east into the bad low country toward Marsh Halloway, and that the road past Ostwick was flooding. The Duke heard the word flooding and felt it go through him like cold water. He had sent her into that. He had handed her personally into a carriage at dawn and pointed it at 40 miles of drowning road because he had decided at 3 in the morning that his own heart was a thing to be managed like a fever. By 4, the Duke himself was in the saddle. He had told no one he meant to ride. He had meant to send men and wait, because dukes did not chase. But 4 o'clock came, and the light began to go, and the thought of her arriving at the cold, dead dower house at Marsh Halloway and understanding finally that he had truly meant it. That picture got him onto the black horse and out of the gate before he had decided to go. He rode east into a sky going the color of a bruise, and the wind off the marsh came at him cold and directional and full of the smell of rain. And for the first time in his disciplined life, Aldous Sable was running toward the very door he had spent 34 years bolting shut, 40 miles ahead and several hours behind him in the day. Marigold's carriage had stopped. It had stopped because the road had stopped it. A wheel sunk to the axle in the flooded ruts below Ostwick. The coachman cursing in the cold, the light failing. Marigold had climbed down rather than sit useless, had stood in the mud in her good crimson gown, directing the work with the same level voice she used for everything. And when the coachman, embarrassed, told her there was a posting inn a half-mile back where her grace might wait warm, she had refused, because she did not want the day to be longer than it had to be. She wanted to be at Marsh Halloway. She wanted to be inside whatever the rest of her life was going to be, with the door shut, so that she could finally, in private in a cold room 40 miles from anyone, allow herself the weeping she had not permitted herself in the great hall at dawn. She had been holding it all day. It sat behind her ribs like water behind a dam, and the only thing keeping the dam was the certainty that there was, at the end of this road, a door she could close. She had learned to hold a dam very young. Her father, Lord Vane, as the world had known him, hadn't been Lord Vane at all. He had been a younger son of a great and dangerous house who had married a woman a faction at court wanted dead. And when the men who took everything came for the family, he had done the one thing a desperate man can do, and he had buried his wife and daughter under a smaller, plainer name and let the world believe the line had ended. Marigold had grown up not knowing she was hidden, only knowing that her father flinched at certain names and burned certain letters and taught her, above all, the accomplishments a girl was meant to have. The single accomplishment of never letting her face show what was behind it. When he died, the small plain name had no money behind it, and the auction had taken the house and the horses, and even the little writing desk where her mother's letter had once been kept. And Marigold had stood in the cold of that auction at 17, with the letter sewn into her glove and her face arranged into nothing. And she had decided two things that day that had governed every day since. She had decided she would never open the letter, because opening it meant admitting she had nowhere left to go, and she would die before she gave the men who took everything the satisfaction of bringing her that low. And she had decided she would never, ever let anyone choose her for what the letter said she was, only if anyone ever chose her at all, for the woman standing in the cold with her face arranged into nothing. She had got rather good over the years at not being chosen. She had not expected the marriage. She had certainly not expected to lie awake in a duke's grand cold house, listening through a wall to a man who never came in, and find, to her quiet horror, that she had begun to want him to. It was while she stood in the mud, holding that whole long history together with both hands, that the rider found her. He came out of the dusk at a gallop, the Duke's fastest man, and he reined in so hard the horse sat back on its haunches, and he was off and bowing in the mud before she had understood he was real. "Your Grace," he said, breathing hard, "you are not to go on. His Grace's orders. Every road is stopped. He is coming himself." And Marigold Vane, who had not wept at dawn when her husband called her a mistake, who had not wept through 40 miles of cold road, who had held the dam all day with both hands, felt the whole careful structure of her composure tilt. Not break, she would not break, but tilt, at the single impossible word coming. She did not let it show. She had 30 years of not letting things show. She said in a voice so level, it frightened the rider more than tears would have, "Is His Grace unwell?" Because she could think of no other reason in the world that the man who had thrown her away that morning would turn the whole county upside down by nightfall to call her back. The rider did not know how to answer that. He only knew his Duke had come out of the great hall with a broken seal in his fist and a face he had never seen on him, and had sealed the duchy like a man sealing a wound. So he said the only true thing he had, "I think, Your Grace, that His Grace made a mistake this morning, and he has spent the whole day discovering it." And then, far down the dark road behind him, came the sound of a single horse, ridden too fast for the conditions, and a swinging point of lantern light. And Marigold turned toward it in the mud and the failing light and did not move, because she had decided, somewhere in the last minute, that she was not going to make this easy, and that if the Duke of Ravenscar wanted to unsay 3 words he had said at dawn, he was going to have to do it to her face in the cold with his own breath. He nearly rode past her. In the dark and the rain starting, he saw the stranded carriage and the lantern, and the small, straight figure standing in the road. And he hauled the black horse to a stop so hard it slid in the mud, and he was down out of the saddle and walking toward her. Before he had words ready, which had never once happened to him in his life, he stopped a few feet from her. The rain came down between them, and the Duke of Ravenscar, who had ordered the silencing of a hall and the stopping of a county, found that he had nothing prepared, no campaign, no clean, cold sentence, and that all the discipline he had spent a lifetime building had brought him exactly here, to a flooded road at nightfall, standing in front of a woman he had called a mistake, with the rain in his eyes and absolutely nothing in his armory but the truth. "I read the letter," he said. It was the worst possible thing he could have said, and he knew it the instant it left him, because Marigold's chin came up, and her green eyes went cold as the road. And she understood in one terrible beat exactly what he was telling her, that he had ridden 40 miles not for her but for Westford, not for the wife but for the crest, that she had finally found a man who would chase her into the dark, and it was for her rank after all, the way it had always been for her rank. She felt the dam behind her ribs turn to ice. "Of course you did," she said, and her voice could have cut the rain in half. "And now you know I outrank you. How convenient, your grace, that your heart returned the very hour my title did. Stand aside. I have a cold house to be cold in." And she turned to climb back into the broken carriage, and the whole story hung on the next thing the Duke of Ravenscar would say, and for one breath he said nothing at all, because she had named the exact shape of the thing he most feared was true about himself. Then he reached out in the rain, and he did not take her arm or her hand. He took the broken seal out of his coat. The crimson wax snapped in two, and he held it out to her on his open palm, and he let the rain fall on it. "I rode out before I'd read past the third line," he said. The cold control had gone out of his voice entirely. What was left was raw and unguarded, and it stopped her with her hand on the carriage door. "I rode out when I read the word mistake. Your mother's word, not mine, though I'd said it too, and understood I'd put it on you myself, at dawn, in my own hall, in front of a child who folds swans because you taught her to. I didn't know you were Westford. Know you. I don't care that you are. I sealed the roads at noon, and I didn't know the crest until Birch brought your gloves at 1. The wanting came first. The wanting came every night, for 11 nights, listening to you turn pages through the wall, and I called it a weakness because the only love I ever watched up close hollowed a strong man into a grave, and I am a coward, Marigold. I am a coward who would rather throw away the best thing in his house than risk it being taken from him. You did not run from me this morning. I ran from you. I have spent the entire day finding out that there is no distance long enough to cure a man of you. 40 miles only taught me the count of them." He closed his fist around the broken seal. "Be Westford, be no one. Be a beggar's daughter who folds paper swans. I turned every carriage in my duchy around to say one thing to you, and rank has nothing to do with it. Come home. Not to Marsh Halloway. Home." The rain came down. The lantern guttered. Marigold Vane stood with her hand on the cold carriage door, and the dam behind her ribs finally broke. But not into the weeping she had been saving for a locked room at the end of the world. It broke quietly, a spring thaw rather than a flood, into something running and alive. She had spent her whole life waiting for someone to choose her before they knew her worth, and here was a man who had sealed a county for her at noon, and not learned her name was a crown until 1 o'clock, which meant she did the arithmetic the way she did everything clearly, that for 1 whole hour the Duke of Ravenscar had turned the world upside down for a woman he believed was nothing but his own discarded wife. 1 hour. It was the most honest hour anyone had ever given her. She did not make it easy even then. She was Westford. She had her pride too. She looked at the broken seal in his fist and she said, "You called me a mistake in front of the staff. They'll have it round the county by now." And he said without hesitation, "Then we'll give the county a longer story. Come home and let them watch me spend the rest of my life unsaying it." And the corner of her mouth moved against her will, the first softness she had let anyone see in 11 days. And she said, "The rest of your life is a great many evenings, Your Grace." And he said very low, "Oink, it will not be enough of them." And the rain ran down both their faces, and neither of them this time pretended it was rain. They did not fall into each other's arms in the road. That is not how people who have spent their lives armored come back to each other. The coachman got the wheel free at last, and the Duke handed her up into the carriage and into his own dry coat. And then, because he could not bear to be even a carriage wall away from her now, he did not get in. He walked the black horse beside the mended carriage the whole long way back, his head level with the window. And they talked for the first time in 11 days, in the dark, with the marsh wind dropping and the rain easing, and the lantern swinging between them. She told him about the auction, and the aunt who counted potatoes and made a charity of every meal, and the father who had buried a duchy under the name Vane to keep his daughter alive, when grander men would have used her as a counter in their games. She told him about the letter sewn into her glove for 6 years, and the promise she had made never to open it, and what it had cost her to keep that promise on the mornings when there truly had been nowhere left to go. She did not tell him to wound him. She told him because, for the first time in her adult life, she had met a person in front of whom she did not have to arrange her face into nothing, and the relief of it loosened her tongue more than any wine, more than any. He listened the way she imagined he did everything once he committed to it, completely, exactly, missing none of it. And twice she watched his jaw tighten at a thing in her past, and she understood that the cold Duke of Ravenscar had a temper for cruelty that was not his own, and that it was perhaps the warmest thing about him. He told her about the brother in the cold gallery, Edmund, who had been the warm one and was meant to inherit, and about the father who had been killed slowly by love, and about the boy of 11 who had made himself a promise at a graveside, and the man of 34 who had spent a single morning learning that the promise had not protected him from grief at all. It had only guaranteed he would die, having felt none of the other thing. "I thought I was being strong," he said at one point, very low, his hand on the carriage door as he walked. "I've been a coward for 9 years and called it strength, and it took putting you on this road to see it." And Marigold, who had spent her whole life being brave for an audience of no one, looked at this proud man walking 40 miles in the wet rather than sit a coat's width from her, and felt the last of the ice go out of her chest. By the time the towers of Ravenscar showed black against a clearing sky and a rising moon, they were not a transaction the lawyers had arranged. They were two people who had each spent the day discovering, by opposite roads, the same thing. that the door you bolt against the world is also the door you starve behind. The county did talk, of course. By the next market day, every inn between Ravenscar and the sea had the tale, embroidered past all recognition, how the cold Duke had sent his bride off at dawn and gone mad by noon and stopped every wheel in the duchy by dark. What the inns did not have, because only the great hall saw it, was the homecoming. Posy the kitchen child was waiting at the top of the steps, having refused all day to go to bed, having been found 3 times by the cook and 3 times crept back to her post by the door, because a lady who had folded her a swan had said that ladies who go away come back when the road's dry, and Posy had decided to believe it harder than anyone had ever believed anything. When Marigold came in out of the cold, the girl flew down the whole flight and clung to her cloak, and Marigold knelt on the cold flags in her ruined crimson gown, and produced from her own sleeve the muddy handkerchief Swan the child had given back to her in the courtyard at dawn, and she smoothed it and folded it fresh and pressed it again into the small red hand. The Duke of Ravenscar stood in the doorway of his own hall, soaked to the skin, watching his wife kneel on the stone to mend a paper bird for a kitchen child. And a thing he had spent a lifetime keeping locked came quietly, permanently unlatched, and he found he did not want it locked again. Birch took the wet coats, and if the old valet's eyes were brighter than usual, he had the dignity to blame the cold. Cromwell, the great grey cat, who had refused to leave the spot by the door all day, came out from the hearth and pressed himself against Marigold's ankle and stayed. The seal, the broken crimson seal of Westford. Marigold did not hide it again, but she did not flourish it either. She had it set, the 2 halves joined, into a small frame, and she hung it, not in the great hall where guests would see and gossip, but in the morning room, over the little table where she finished at last the borrowed novel she had been 3 pages from at dawn. The crest stayed in the family, but out of the world's mouth. They were Ravenscar to the county, and always would be, because Aldous had asked her quietly one evening whether she wished to claim Westford and take her seat in her own right. And Marigold had thought about it with her clear arithmetic, and said she had spent her whole life being valued for a crest, and had only just been chosen without one, and she did not intend to start trading on it now. The Duchy of Westford went on sleeping under its black winter. The woman it belonged to chose instead a morning room with a chipped gold teacup and a cat and a man who turned a carriage around for nothing. He never sent her away again. He never came close. But there was one habit he kept for the rest of his long life, and it is the truest thing I can tell you about how the cold Duke of Ravenscar loved in the end. Every dawn, every single dawn, the hour he had once chosen to be rid of her, he found her wherever she was in the waking house, the morning room or the gallery or the cold courtyard, where a child had once run crying across the gravel, and he said 3 words to her, not the 3 he had said the first time, 3 different ones, said quietly, like a man closing a ledger he had finally got right. And he watched her face every dawn to make sure she had heard them, because a man who has learned what silence costs does not leave the most important sentence in his life to be assumed. She kept the swan-folded handkerchief in a drawer. The kitchen child grew up in that house and married well out of it, and folded swans for her own children and told them, when they were old enough, that a duchess had once knelt on cold flags for her at the worst moment of a great lady's life and never once let the lady see her own. and the broken seal hung in the morning room, mended and framed, catching the dawn light, a small bright reminder that the most dangerous thing a proud man can do is mistake the size of what he is throwing away. So here is the question, and it is yours to answer. If you had stood in that cold hall at dawn and been called a mistake by the one person whose choosing you most wanted, would you have left dry-eyed and spine straight the way Marigold did, refusing them the sight of your tears, and trusted that what was real would come and find you on the road? Or would you have turned at the door and made him say it again, to your face, and dared him to mean it? Tell me which kind of pride is the braver one? I have spent a great many dawns wondering, and I am still not sure.